Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and you're here for IAS Thursday. You've seen some announcements rotating across your screens, and I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of them. Tomorrow morning, we're hosting the Human in the Data Symposium from 10 to 12, and it will be followed by a short information session for graduate students interested in applying for this coming summer's Human in the Data Fellowships. The information about the fellowships and the application is on the IAS website, and applications will be due March 10th. I also want to note that the Mellon-funded Minnesota Transform Just Futures initiative is hiring a media specialist and an internship coordinator. So look for more information on the IAS website about that. And finally, next week, same time, not exactly the same link. There will be IAS Thursday will be on gendered health institutions, examining the organization of health services and men's engagement in HIV care in Malawi. So we hope you'll come back and join us then. Just a few Zoom instructions. This is a webinar, so the chat is not fully interactive. So you can type your questions at any point in the little Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. And at the end of the presentation, I will read them to Professor Fitzpatrick. Also, if you would like to see subtitles for today's event, click on the live transcript box and choose show subtitles. I'd like to start by offering a land acknowledgement and by acknowledging that we are all residing on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The University of Minnesota resides on Dakota land ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. The Institute for Advanced Study acknowledges that this place has a complex and layered history, and this land acknowledgement is one of the ways in which we work to educate the campus and community about the land and our relationships with it and with each other. The IAS is committed to ongoing efforts to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. Well, it's my very great pleasure to introduce today Professor Kathleen Fitzpatrick, who is Director of Digital Humanities and Professor of English at Michigan State University, where she also directs MESH, a research and development unit focused on the future of scholarly communications. We've had a little reading group at the IAS on generous thinking, and in fact, we're happy to organize more. Look on the IAS website for information. So we've been looking forward to this event for a long time. Professor Fitzpatrick is Project Director of Humanities Commons, an open access, open source network serving more than 25,000 scholars and practitioners across the humanities and around the world. And she is author of Generous Thinking, the book I was just holding up, published by Johns Hopkins in 2019, as well as author of Planned Obsolescence, Publishing Technology and the Future of the Academy, and The Anxiety of Obsolescence, the American Novel in the Age of Television. Professor Fitzpatrick is president of the Association for Computers and the Humanities and a member of the boards of directors of the Council on Library and Information Resources and of the Educopia Institute. She's currently working on sort of the sequel to Generous Thinking, on how we implement generous thinking and how we prepare for leadership in a time of institutional transformation. So without further ado, Professor Fitzpatrick.
Thank you so much. And thank all of you for attending this afternoon. I'm sorry that I'm not able to be with you, but it's really delightful to be able to give talks like this nonetheless. And I'm really thrilled that the Institute for Advanced Study invited me to talk with you, particularly about generous thinking. This talk is a highly compressed overview of the book, whose overall argument is that the future of higher education really demands that those of us on campus pay more attention to building relationships of trust with the many publics that the university serves. And evidence of the need for building those trusting relationships between universities and the public can be found in a lot of different places, but in particular in an increasing number of studies, such as this one, that was released in 2017 by the Pew Research Center, which shows a precipitous decline in the esteem that colleges and universities are held in the United States, and particularly on the political right. Now, one frequent on-campus reaction to this kind of report, understandably, is to decry the rampant anti-intellectualism in contemporary culture and to sort of turn inward, to spend more time talking with those who understand us, meaning us, right? But in that reaction, we run the risk of deepening the divide, right? Allowing those who want to argue that today's colleges and universities are not only irrelevant, but actively detrimental to the well-being of the general public to say, see, they're out of touch. Who needs them anyway? Because this shift in public opinion that we're seeing here didn't just happen, right? It was made to happen as part of a program of discrediting and privatizing public services across the nation. However, from time to time, we're confronted with undeniable evidence that many of our institutions, and even those institutions that most profess their commitment to public service, have utterly betrayed the trust that the public has placed in them. Which is to say that the problem isn't just that the public doesn't understand the importance of what it is we do, it's also that we have in many ways failed, right? Failed to make that importance clear, failed to protect our communities on campus and off, failed to build institutions that are genuinely structurally capable of living out the values that they profess. So a large part of what I'm after in generous thinking is to press for new ways of understanding our institutions as communities, as well as in interaction with communities, asking us to take a closer look at the ways that we communicate, both with one another and with a range of broader publics about and around our work. Asking us, in other words, to examine how our colleges and universities engage with the world. And some really focused thinking about that mode of public engagement is in order, I would suggest, because as we have seen over the last year, our institutions are facing not just a single crisis, but a panoply of crises, and crises that we cannot solve on our own. Now, some of these crises that I'm going to point to in this talk, I want to acknowledge don't always give the impression of being life-threatening or world historical or approaching the kind or degree of the highly volatile political, economic, environmental, and health-related situations that we face today. And yet the decline in public support for higher education is of a piece with those other crises, right? Part of a series of national and international transformations in assumptions about the responsibility of governments for the public good. And in fact, the very notion that there can be such a thing as the public good in the first place. And the consequences of those transformations are indeed life or death in many cases. So while some might take my argument about the importance of generosity for the future of the university to be a kind of self-indulgent head in the sand retreat into philosophizing and a refusal of real political action, I hope that in the larger project, I've put together a case for why this is not so. Why, in fact, the particular modes of generous thinking that I'm asking us to undertake within and around our institutions of higher education have the potential to help us navigate the crises that we all face today. Now, many of our fields are already focused on pressing public issues, and many of us as scholars are already working in publicly engaged ways. And part of my argument is that we need to find ways to generalize that engagement and to think about the ways that it might, if permitted, transform the institution and the ways that we all work within it. That is to say, the best of what the university has to offer may lie less in its power to advance knowledge or solve problems in any of its particular fields than in our more crucial ability to be a model and support for generous thinking as a way of being in and with the world. Okay, but first, who is this we that I keep referring to, and what is it precisely that we do, and why does it matter? Much of my argument focuses on the university's permanent faculty, partially because that faculty is my community of practice, and partially because of the extent to which the work that's done by that faculty is higher education, right? Research and teaching are the primary purposes and the visible outputs of our institutions. And moreover, the principles of shared governance under which we operate, at least in theory, suggest that tenured and tenure-track faculty members have a significant responsibility for shaping the future of the university. So that's my we, but I do want to be careful in the ways that I deploy it, not least because, as Helen Small has pointed out, the first person plural is a rhetorical sleight of hand by which the concerns of the profession can be made to seem entirely congruent with those of the democratic polity as a whole. Now, I hope that my argument has something important to say to folks who work on university campuses but are not faculty, right? Or who don't work on university campuses at all, and that it might become possible for the we that I'm addressing to refer to all of us on campus and off who want to strengthen both our systems of higher education and our ways of engaging with one another in order to help us all build stronger communities. But it's important to acknowledge that the we that bears the greatest responsibility for caring for the university and for building relationships between the university and the broader publics that it serves, and thus the most immediate antecedent for my we is those of us on campus, right? And especially the faculty. Now, every we implies a them, of course, and the ways that we define and conceive of that them points to one of the primary problems of the contemporary university, and especially public universities in the US. These institutions were founded explicitly to serve the people of their states or regions or communities, and thus those publics should be part of us. And yet the borders of the campus have done more than define a space. Right? They determine a sense of belonging as well, transforming everything off campus into them, this kind of generalized other that sometimes gets imagined to be the audience for our performances, right? A passive group that takes in information that we provide. But what might it mean if we understood them as a complex collection of communities, not just groups who interact with one another and with us, but groups of which we are in fact a part, right? How might this lead to a richer sense, not just of them, but of the us that we together form? I mean, we talk a lot, after all, about community on campus, both about community engagement and about the university itself as a community, but we don't often talk a lot about what it is we mean when we invoke the concept. Miranda Joseph, in her utterly brilliant book, Against the Romance of Community, explores the way in which the term community gets mythologized or romanticized, as she suggests. And so the concept comes to serve what she calls a supplementary role with respect to capitalism, sort of filling in its gaps and smoothing over its flaws in ways that permit capitalism to function without any real opposition. Beyond that, community in the singular, right, the community, also runs the risk of being a disciplinary force, a declaration of groupness that is designed to produce the us that inevitably suggests that them. So if we're able to understand community instead of being singular and disciplinary, instead as multiple and multifarious, as shifting entities that serve strategic purposes, we might be able to think of community as an activity, right, as a practice of solidarity, as a process of coalition building. And this sense of solidarity is in fact a key part of the university's recent past, one of the most important elements of its history that has in fact been utterly undone by recent political shifts. As Roderick Ferguson has detailed, the student-led calls for institutional change in the 1960s and 1970s in many ways focused on the potential that the university held and ultimately failed to meet for connecting with the communities around it. Instead, our institutions have turned inward, right? They've become self-protective. They've looked away from the possibility of building solidarity with the publics that the university was meant to serve. And so community in this strategic sense has been one of the university's weaknesses when it should have been its strength. If we're going to save our institutions from the relentless economic and political forces that are threatening to undo them today, we have to begin to understand our campus as a site where new kinds of communities and new kinds of solidarities can be built. However, in building those relationships, we have to contend with the fact that what faculty members do on our campuses is often a mystery and in fact a site of profound misunderstanding for people outside the academic profession and at times even for each other. One of the key areas of misunderstanding, and the one that I think needs most opening up, is the fundamental purpose of higher education. Public figures such as politicians increasingly discuss colleges and universities as sites of workforce preparation, right? Making it seem as though the provision of career-enhancing credentials were the sole purpose for which our institutions exist, and as if everything else they do that does not lead directly to economic growth were a misappropriation of resources. Now, those of us who do work on campus, however, understand our institutions not as credentialing agencies, but as sites of broad-based education, a liberal education in the original sense of the term. Now, of course, the term liberal education, so natural to those of us who are engaged in it, has itself become profoundly politicized, as if the liberal bent of higher education were not its breadth, but its ideology. So we see, for instance, the state of Colorado stripping the concept of liberal education out of official university documents. But even where that concept, liberal education, isn't imagined to be cover for some kind of revolution that we're fomenting on campus, there's a widespread misconception about it that's almost worse. That liberal education is a mode of education in which we waste taxpayer resources by disseminating, developing, and ultimately filling our students' heads with useless knowledge that will not lead to a productive career path. And nowhere is this misconception more focused than on the humanities. Right? Now, the portrait that I'm about to sketch of the humanities today could be extended to many other areas within the curriculum. For instance, the sciences focus on basic science or science without direct industry applicability is often imagined to be just as frivolous. But the humanities, right, the study of literature, history, art, philosophy, and other forms of culture are in certain ways both the core and the limit case of the liberal arts. The humanities cultivate an inquisitive mindset. They teach key skills of reading and interpretation, and they focus on writing in ways that can prepare a student to learn absolutely anything over the course of their lives. And yet, of course, these are the fields around which no end of hilarious jokes about what a student might actually do with that degree have been constructed. I mean, the answer, of course, is absolutely anything. As a recent report from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences has made clear, not only do humanities majors end up gainfully employed, but they actually wind up happy. But I digress. The thing to note is that the humanities serve as a bellwether of sorts. What's been happening to them is happening to higher education in general, if a little more slowly. So while I focus a bit on the kinds of arguments that are being made about the humanities in our culture today, it doesn't take too much of a stretch to imagine these same arguments today being made about sociology or about physics or about any other field on campus that isn't named after a specific well-paying career. The humanities, in any case, have long been lauded as providing students with a rich set of interpretive, critical, and ethical skills with which they can engage the world around them. These skills are increasingly necessary in today's hyper-mediated, globalized, conflict-filled world, and yet many humanities departments feel themselves increasingly marginalized within their own institutions. And this marginalization is related, if not directly attributable, to the degree to which students, parents, administrators, trustees, politicians, the media, and the public at large have been led in this self-reinforcing cycle to believe that the skills that these fields provide are useless in the current economic environment, right? So somebody particularly visible makes a publicly disparaging remark about all of those English majors working at Starbucks. Commentators reinforce the sense that humanities majors are worth less than pre-professional degrees. Parents strongly encourage their students to turn toward pragmatic fields that seem somehow to describe a job. Administrators note a decline in humanities majors and cut budgets and positions. The jobs crisis for humanities PhDs worsens. Somebody particularly visible makes a publicly disparaging remark about what all those adjuncts were planning on doing with that humanities PhD anyhow, and the whole thing intensifies. And in many institutions, this draining away of majors and faculty and resources has reduced the humanities to a means of ensuring that students studying to become engineers and bankers are reminded of the human ends of their work. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not a terrible thing in and of itself, but it's not sufficient ground on which humanities fields can do their best work for the institution. And while this kind of cyclical crisis has not manifested to anything like the same extent in the sciences, there are early indications that it may be spreading in that direction. I mean, where once the world at large seemed mostly to understand that scientific research and the kinds of study that support it are crucial to the general advancement of knowledge, recent shifts in funder priorities and policies suggest a growing scrutiny of that work's economic rather than educational impact, as well as a growing restriction on research areas that have been heavily politicized. So the humanities, again, may be a kind of canary in the higher education coal mine. And for that reason, it's really crucial that we pay close attention to what's happened in those fields, and particularly to the things that haven't worked as the humanities have tried to remedy the situation. Now, one of the key things that hasn't worked is the impassioned plea on behalf of humanities fields. A welter of defenses of the humanities from both outside and inside the academy have been published in recent years, and each of them has seemed slightly more defensive than the last, and none of them have had the desired impact. I mean, calls to save the humanities issued by public figures frequently leave scholars annoyed, frankly, as they often begin with what feels like a pretty retrograde sense of what it is that we do and why. And so they often give the feeling that they're trying to save the humanities from us. One might see, for instance, a column that was published in 2016 by the former chairman of the NEH, Bruce Cole, entitled "What's Wrong with the Humanities?" Which begins memorably. Let's face it, too many humanities scholars are alienating students and the public with their opacity, triviality, and irrelevance. But perhaps even worse is the degree to which humanities professors themselves, right? Those who you would think most well-positioned to make the case, have failed to find traction with their arguments. And as these unsuccessful defenses proliferate, the public view of the humanities becomes all the worse, leading Simon During to grumble that whatever things it is the humanities do well, it is beginning to look as if promoting themselves is not one of them. And maybe we like it that way, as we're often the ones who take issue with our own defenses, bitterly disagreeing, as we frequently do, about the purposes and the practices of our field. So perhaps this is a good moment for us to stop and consider what it is that the humanities do well. I mean, what the humanities are for. So I'm going to start with a basic definition of the humanities as a cluster of fields that focus on the careful study and analysis of cultures and their many modes of thought and forms of representation: writing, music, art, media, and so on, as they've developed and moved through time and across geographical boundaries, growing out of and adding to our senses of who we are as individuals, as groups, and as nations. The humanities are interested then in the ways that representations work, right? In the relationships between representations and social structures, in all of the ways that human ideas and their expression shape and are shaped by human culture. And so in this definition, we might begin to see the possibility that studying literature or history or art or film or philosophy might not be solely about the object itself, right? But instead about a way of engaging with the world. In the process of this study, we develop the ability to understand the multiple layers of what's being communicated in the world and why, and the capacity to put together for ourselves an appropriate, thoughtful contribution. Now, the first thing to note about this definition is that I am certain that many humanities scholars who have read it or hear it from me will disagree with it, that they will have nuances or correctives to offer. And it's important to understand that this disagreement doesn't necessarily mean that my definition is wrong. Nor, however, do I mean to suggest that the nuances and correctives that would be presented are wrong. Rather, that form of disagreement is at the heart of what we do. We hear one another's interpretations, whether of texts or of performances or of historical events, and we push back against them. We advance the work in our field through disagreement and revision. And this agonistic approach, I want to argue, is both a strength of the humanities and, by extension, of the university in general, and its Achilles heel, a thought to which I'll return shortly. For the moment, though, back to Simon During and his sense that the humanities are terrible at self-promotion. During's complaint, which was levied at the essays included in Peter Brooks and Hilary Jewett's volume, The Humanities and Public Life, is largely that in the act of self-defense, humanities scholars leave behind doing what they do and instead turn to sermonizing, his word, about the value of what they do. And he argues that part of the problem is the assumption that the humanities, as we practice them, ought to have a public life in the first place, right? He winds up suggesting that we should continue to ensure that there's sufficient state support for the humanities so that students who don't already occupy a position of financial comfort can study our fields, but that we should not stretch beyond that point, arguing for the public importance of studying the humanities, because as he sees it, that importance is primarily and overwhelmingly private. And this sense, right, that the education in the humanities is primarily of private value is everywhere in today's popular discourse, extended to higher education in general, right? The purpose, we are told, of a college degree is some form of personal enrichment, whether financial or otherwise, rather than a social good. The privatization of higher education's benefits, which is part of the general privatization that Chris Newfield has referred to as the Academy's great mistake, has been accompanied by a similar shift in costs, right, from the state to individual families and students, resulting in the downward spiral in funding and other forms of public support in which our institutions and our fields are caught, as well as the astronomically increasing debt load faced by our students and their families. So as long as a university education is understood to have a predominantly personal rather than social benefit, it will be argued that making such an education possible is a private rather than a public responsibility. And that mindset will of necessity lead to the devaluation of fields whose benefits are less immediately tangible, less material, less individual. if we're going to correct course, if we're going to restore public support for our institutions and our fields, we have to find ways to make clear the public goals that our fields have and the public good that our institutions serve. Okay, but what is that public good? We don't do a terribly good job of articulating these things. I mean, in fact, despite the role that so many of us have as professors, we often seem to have a hard time professing, describing what we do and arguing on behalf of the values that sustain our work. I mean, it's hard to express our values without recourse to what often feel to us like politically regressive, universalizing master narratives about the nature of the good that have long been used as a means of solidifying and perpetuating the social order with all of its injustices and exclusions. And so instead of stating clearly and passionately the ethics and the values and the goals that we bring to our work, we critique. Right? We protect ourselves with what Lisa Ruddick has described as the game of academic cool. In order to avoid appearing naive or worse, complicit, we complicate, right? We argue, we read against the grain. And this mode of critique gets mistaken in public discourse for being primarily ideological in intent and effect, right? This is how our universities come to be accused of brainwashing their students, filling their heads with leftist rejections of the basic goodness of the dominant Western culture. Now, on campus, we know that's not the case. Right? The political and social commitments behind much of our work are real and are crucial, but even our most critical reading practices turn out to be perfectly compatible with the contemporary political landscape. In fact, I would argue that our critiques of contemporary culture do not simply surface out of our social commitments. I mean, rather they surface not just despite, but in fact because of the conservative leaning systems and structures in which the university as a whole and each of us as a result is mired. But our tendency to read against the grain is part of our makeup precisely because of the ways that we ourselves are subject to politics rather than being able to stand outside and neutrally analyze the political. The politics that we are subject to structures all institutions in the contemporary United States, and perhaps especially universities. A politics that makes inevitable the critical, the negative, the rejection of everything that's gone before. It's a politics that's structured around competition and what historian Winfried Fluck has referred to as the race for individual distinction. Now, however much we might reject individualism as part and parcel of the neoliberal mainstream, our working lives on campus and off are overdetermined by it. The entire academic enterprise serves to cultivate individualism, in fact, beginning with college applications, extending through graduate school admissions, fellowship applications, the job market, publication submissions, and seemingly finally the tenure and promotion review. Those of us on campus are subject to selection. Right? And these processes present themselves as meritocratic, right? Here are some metrics for quality against which all of our candidates are measured, and the best, whatever that might mean in a given context, are rewarded. In actual practice, however, those metrics are never neutral. And what we are measured against is far more often one another than some neutral idea. So always in the unconscious of the profession, there's competition, right? For resources, for positions, for acclaim. And the drive to compete that this mode of being instills in us can't ever be fully contained by their specific processes, right? It bleeds out into all of the ways that we work, even when we're working together. The competitive individualism that the academy cultivates makes all of us painfully aware that even our most collaborative efforts will ultimately be assessed individually, right? With the result that even those fields whose advancement most depends on team-based efforts are required to develop careful guidelines for establishing credit and priority. This competitive individualism contradicts and in fact undermines all of the most important communal aspects of life within our institutions of higher education. Our principles of shared governance, for instance, are built on the notion that universities best operate as collectives, in which all members contribute to their direction and functioning. But in actual practice, our all too clear understanding that service to the institution will not count when faculty are evaluated and ranked for salary increases and promotions encourages us to avoid that labor, right? To reserve our time and energy for those aspects of our work that will enable our individual achievement. And the results are not good for any of us, right? Faculty disengage from their colleagues, from the functioning of the institution and the shared purposes that it serves, while university governance becomes increasingly managed by administrators, ostensibly freeing the faculty up to focus on the competitive work that will allow us as individuals and our universities as institutions sorry, I lost my place for just a second, and our universities as institutions to climb the rankings, right? And this is no way to run a collective, right? It's also no way to build solidarity among academic units or across categories of academic employment or between the academy and the communities with which it engages. And perhaps that's the point. I'm sorry, they have just told me that I am not sharing my screen. Have I gone through all of this without sharing my slides?
Yes.
I am so sorry. Okay, my slides are not that interesting, and I am animated, so perhaps it's all fine.
It seemed fine to me. I wasn't missing anything.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Apologies to all of you. I am now going to continue without my slides, and it will just be animated me since we are almost done here. In any event, as I was just saying, that we're undermining our own solidarity within the academy by engaging in this kind of competitive individualism, and also undermining the potential for solidarity between the academy and the communities that it serves. And that may well be the point, right? Perhaps we have been locked into this endless competition with one another in order to keep us distracted from the work that we might do if we were truly joined together. This requirement, right, that we continually compare ourselves with one another, that we only take on the work that will lead to our own individual achievement, is inseparable from the privatization that Newfield describes as the political unconscious of the contemporary university. Competition and the race for individual distinction structure the growing conviction that not only the benefits of higher education, but also all of our categories of success can only ever be personal, private, individual, rather than social, right? So how do we step off of this treadmill? And how do we begin to insist upon living our academic lives another way? How do we return to the collective, the social, the communal potential that higher education should enable? And this, at last, is where I get to bring in generous thinking, right? Which is a way of being that I propose as an alternative to the contemporary or the competitive thinking in which the contemporary academy is steeped. Generous thinking is not intended to be opposed to critical thinking, right? In fact, I argue strongly that the best of our critical thinking is always steeped in generosity. Rather, generous thinking involves the wholehearted embrace of the deepest values of the humanities, among them attention, care, and equity, in order to create communities that can think critically together, both on campus and across the campus borders. So what is it I mean when I talk about generosity in this context? The book obviously spends a lot more time exploring this question, but for the moment, I think of generosity as a practice, right? It's something to which we have to return again and again. It's an approach to engagement that focuses first and foremost on developing a generosity of mind and openness to possibility. And that openness begins for me by trying to develop a listening presence in the world, which is to say a conversational disposition that's not merely waiting for my next opportunity to speak, but instead genuinely paying attention to what's being said. It means caring about the concerns of my interlocutor as much as I care about my own. It means beginning from the assumption that in any given exchange, I likely have less to teach than I have to learn. Generous thinking also means working to think with rather than against the people and the texts with whom I'm in dialogue. It means starting an encounter with an idea with yes rather than no, or with and rather than but. Because yes and creates the possibility for genuine dialogue, not only among academic colleagues, but with our objects of study, with our predecessors, and with our many potential publics as well. Yes, and asks us to step away from competition, from the race for professional distinction. When we allow ourselves to sort of linger in that yes, and we create the possibility of working together to build something entirely new. And it's through that working together that we can begin to build the kinds of connections with the public that might help us turn the tide on the declining esteem that our institutions and higher education in general are held in. This mode of generous thinking is already instantiated in a wide range of projects that focus on fostering public engagement in and through the work done in colleges and universities. And collaborations with the public can work to create a sense of collective ownership of and investment in the university, making the institution's relevance to contemporary communities abundantly clear. But this mode of working in public asks a lot of us, right? It asks us to stop disseminating our work solely in the venues that give us the greatest chance at the forms of individual prestige for which we're rewarded on campus, and instead to start looking for ways to make our work a gift to the world. It asks us to accept the risk involved in writing for audiences with whom we're less familiar than we are with our colleagues, finding ways to draw them into our concerns and to acquaint ourselves with theirs. It asks us not just to bring our knowledge to those audiences, but in fact to open space for them to become interlocutors, bringing us their own knowledge in response. It takes a lot of work, difficult, scary, failure-filled work to allow ourselves to become open to this kind of engagement. We're prone as scholars to focus on conversations with those we already know well and in forms we already know we do well. And there are times when our attempts to address public audiences go badly. It's possible that Simon During is in fact on to something here when he notes that humanities professors in the act of public professing turn away from doing what they do and towards sermonizing about our field's value. The problem isn't, though, assuming that there's a public value in what we do, because there is. It's the mode of sermonizing that's the issue, right? Too much professional public address takes the form of the tone or the edifying lecture, right? And I do recognize the irony of pointing this out 37 minutes into a public talk, but here we are. In any event, that mode of instructing the less privileged on better ways of being is part of the problem that I'm trying to get at here. And so if, contra During, we really do believe that there's a public value to the work of the humanities, we have to find ways to engage the public as equals rather than lecturing to them. And we have to prepare for and accept the vulnerability involved in doing away with the hierarchy of teacher and learner, and instead find ways to engage in open-ended, multi-directional, generous conversation. And in that conversation lies the possibility of building solidarity with the concerns of the publics that we hope to reach, as well as the possibility of encouraging understanding of our own concerns. But in that conversation lies the possibility of creating another mode of being for the 21st century university and for those who care about it. In that conversation lies the possibility of developing a new understanding of how expertise is structured and how it functions. In that conversation lies the possibility of a higher education whose ends are social rather than individual, aimed at community building rather than personal achievement. And in all of those conversations, in which we engage perspectives other than our own, in which we value the production and manifestation of our diverse culture, in which we encounter the other in all of its irreducible otherness, in those conversations lie the best of what the humanities can bring to the university and the university to the world. So thank you very much. I am sorry not to have gotten to show you my slides, but as I said, they are less interesting than many slides are. I'll be happy to actually, in fact, I can very quickly just show you my thank you slide, which has some information on it, including where you can find the presentation so that you can see the visuals that you missed. Sorry about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. That was really great. And we did already have someone comment in the Q&A that it was totally great without the slides. So I'll remind the panelists, I'll remind the attendees to enter your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get started there right now. So one of our audience says, thank you for your talk. I agree with your critique of higher education and how it supports the race of individual distinction. What I'd like to hear more about are specific examples of generous thinking that can help to change this structure. Can you discuss any generous thinking projects in which you've participated?
Absolutely, absolutely. There are a bunch of different projects that I do dig into in the book that take different forms. Some of the forms of generous thinking that I'm interested in are really thinking about ways that we can open up and share our ways of working with a broader public to enable sort of participation in and a view of the work that we do in ways that can be significant. And so I talk about some public reading projects, for instance, and other kinds of university investment in communities that can really help support a greater understanding of what it is that we do on campus. I also talk a bit about the importance of scholars working in public in a variety of ways, as I mentioned here, and this can be publishing in more open access venues. It can be writing in public registers, and so therefore publishing in places where the public can find the work that we're doing, rather than sort of holding it only in scholarly venues. And it can really be thinking about communal projects in which we're working with the public on issues and interests that the public has, that we can bring the university's resources to engage with issues that we all share commonly. And there are a slew of different projects that fall under that umbrella. I have a tendency to think about a couple of them in particular. University of Wisconsin-Madison's University project, it's CITY, which brings together folks from a bunch of different interdisciplinary fields to work with individual municipalities in Wisconsin on their issues. And so the students and the faculty who are working with these municipalities get experience in helping solve real problems out in the world. And the municipalities recognize the university as a place where they can go for help with things that they can't do themselves. So it's a really wonderful program. The other thing that I would point to in that regard is a project that came out of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County's Drescher Center for the Humanities. They, were interested in having a series within the Humanities Center on race in contemporary urban life. And rather than going the route of the Humanities Center typically, which is to put together a wonderful slate of speakers who are experts in the field and have them come in and talk about race in urban American life, they instead turned to their community and they convened a series of conversations among religious leaders, community leaders, artists, organizers, and a whole bunch of folks from Baltimore to come talk to the center about their understanding of race in urban American life. And it produces a radically different sense of what the Humanities Center is for when it's being spoken to, rather than being the speaker all the time. Then finally, the last thing that I want to point to in terms of examples is that, for the university to become a genuinely generous institution, the kind of institution that can support projects like that, and not just support them by throwing a sort of term limited budget at them, but really understanding those kinds of projects as being at the core of its mission. The university has got to rethink a lot of its processes and policies regarding what it rewards and how it rewards it. And so I currently am at Michigan State University. I work in the College of Arts and Letters. And the college has been embarked on a multi-year program that is designed to transform our tenure and promotion processes. From being that sort of summative moment at which you look back at the last 6 years and say, did you do enough, right? Have you cleared the hurdle? To instead think of it as a formative process of review. Like, what is your long-term goal for your career? What does success look like to you as a candidate? And then how do the last 6 years sort of demonstrate your progress toward that goal? And how can we now help you in continuing down that path? And it's produced a really, really different sense within a lot of departments in the college of what's possible in terms of research, right? And what the goal of that research is. So that's, one example of the way that we're really trying to think about the institution as itself embodying generosity.
Great, thank you. There are many people saying thanks for this talk, and that it's very thought-provoking. You've provided so much to think about. At the beginning, you talked about the we, for purposes of your talk, being tenure track and tenured faculty. I think universities typically think of themselves as structured by the tenure track faculty, and they center those faculty. I'm wondering how this distinction between faculty and others in the university who also teach, promote learning in many ways, do research, et cetera, may serve to reinforce competitive individualism. How does this internal hierarchy inhibit generous thinking as you describe it?
Oh, my word, that is exactly the right question. And it's completely true that hierarchy of categories of employment on campus, it really produces a lot of the tendencies toward competitive individualism that we experience, because we see ourselves as somehow being in competition with one another, right? That if resources go to the faculty, they don't go elsewhere. And it's true. And, where did I want to go with that? And there are real material forms that hierarchy takes. One of the things that I end up talking about in the book is that the most significant aspect of that hierarchy of categories of employment may well be who on campus has the power to say no and who doesn't, right? Tenured faculty can say no to a whole lot of things and know that those requests are going to roll down onto untenured faculty. Tenure track faculty have certain kinds of abilities to say no. They have certain protections emerging from the tenured faculty that will support them in saying no. But then there are other categories of faculty, fixed term instructors and clinical instructors and so forth, who cannot say no because they're being handed particular assignments. And similarly, even beyond that, the staff in the institution are not empowered to really define the terms of their jobs in the ways that the faculty are. I focus in the book and in this talk primarily on the tenured and tenure track faculty, in part because I think it's our responsibility to make that change. And in a certain way, it's because we have the privilege of being able to rock the boat a bit, that we really need to be making the argument. The danger is, of course, that the tenured and tenure track faculty have a real tendency to make the argument for themselves, right? And not for everybody else. And so one key component of this argument is that we have to begin the process of building solidarity on the campus among the various categories of employment, that we need to be working toward an understanding of all of us, staff, librarians, non-tenure stream faculty, tenure stream faculty, all as one faculty, period. And frankly, should have one union, right? And I will leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. I'm moving around, so excuse me if it seems kind of crazy.
No problem.
I suggest that your we should also include, this is a logical follow in many senses from the last question. I suggest that your we should include retirees of the university, and that public engagement must include volunteer participation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. I would agree with that. I would also argue that that we needs to include not just our current students, but our former students, right? We spend all of this time sort of working with them and training them, and then we send them out into the world, and, you know, we turn to them for donations, right? And that's kind of the last of it. I would really like us to understand those alumni as our greatest resource, and to keep them involved in the life of the university in ways that might encourage them to keep supporting us, not just materially with their donations, but when the university is under certain kinds of threats. We can have the alumni turn out to help support us if we've built that relationship.
Okay, thank you. You have many important things to say here, and you are generous with your ideas. I'm thinking, is there one main or central thing that leading humanities faculty should fight for to reshape the negative factors that hinder generous work? And B, what should be the key venue in which to press the point? Mm-hmm. So should this be a professional association activity or something bigger, such as an AAUP effort, mm-hmm. or smaller, one department at a time?
Yeah, I think what I'm going to suggest is the kind of thing that has to begin both at the top and at the grassroots, right? And it's that we really need to do a deep dive on reconsidering what it is that we consider work within our institutions, and how we support and reward that work. Right now, and this is coming back again to my college's rethinking of tenure and promotion policies and processes. Right now, the things that we evaluate when we evaluate, annual review for merit raises or tenure and promotion, or, all of the kinds of review that we undergo, have very specific categories, the boxes into which things have to go. And our positions, whether we're staff or faculty, all have certain percentages attached to them, right? So, I am 40% research and 40% teaching and 20% service. And every year when I fill out my form, I'm supposed to document that I have done this 40-40-20 divide in my work, which means that with everything that I'm doing, I'm supposed to be thinking about, is this research or is this service? And I think those categories and the ways that we have treated them as these boxes to be filled in end up undermining the ultimate impact of the work that we can do. I mean, what we, in an ideal world, should be evaluated on is things like, our stewardship and sharing of knowledge, which might be a combination of research and teaching and service, depending on how you approach it. We should be evaluated on mentorship and how we're supporting, the students that we work with, but also one another, the faculty and the graduate students and the other folks within our units. And that's, it's sort of teaching, but it's also service. And so forth. So part of what I would really love to see is for us to articulate what the real values of our profession are, right? What it is we're trying to accomplish, and then figure out how to structure evaluation processes that go to those values, rather than that focus on these sort of bean counting processes of figuring out whether you've done enough, whatever enough might be. And that kind of argument can start in some high places, right? I think if the AAUP wanted to take something like that up for the profession and develop some kind of Bill of Rights with respect to thinking about evaluations, whether it was annual review or promotion and tenure or both, that could have a certain kind of impact. But there's also an extraordinary impact to be had at that department by department level. What we're finding, so my department, the Department of English, did a thorough revision of its bylaws 2 years ago in order to describe a much more generous tenure and promotion process. And that work has since been looked at by other departments on campus who have said, oh, actually, you know, our definition of scholarship reads like it was written in 1972 too. And so we should think about what you've done and how we can bring this into our own unit. And it's produced this sense that frees us up in a way to do the work that most matters to us, rather than being constrained by the kinds of work that are going to be rewarded in traditional ways. So I would say, you know, starting at the bottom, starting at the top, both is what needs to happen here.
Great, thank you. I want to change gears for just a minute and say, how can the digital humanities contribute to generous thinking? And does not our new reliance on virtual communication, webinars, Zoom talks, et cetera, offer opportunities to disseminate our work and engage the general public?
Oh, my word, yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think the digital humanities have an awful lot to offer in this direction. Most projects in DH and most folks who've been working in DH for a while have long since recognized that no individual scholar can really do it alone, right? That every project requires a team and it requires a whole bunch of different capacities and capabilities to be brought together in order to affect what is a really complicated thing, right? DH scholars have also figured out that the purpose of that thing that they're building very often is something that has a public impact, right? That it's either engaged, pardon me, engaged with a community process, or it's producing resources that are available to the community. So that's, I think, a lot of where digital humanities has really intersected with some of these ideas. It's also been incumbent on DH to come up with new modes of review for the work that's being done, because traditional double anonymous pre-publication peer review just simply doesn't function when what you're building is a resource that's going to grow and develop over the course of multiple years. So there's a lot to learn there too, from the ways that DH has built new kinds of review processes that maintain quality without being sort of rigidly locked into a particular kind of process. Oh, there was a second part to that question.
I think the second part was that public facing piece.
Oh, okay.
Allow the humanities to reach the public and change those images.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of public work is really crucial. I mean, the impact of a lot of work in public history, in public literary criticism, has really enabled the kinds of deep and rigorous critical thought that are happening on campus to reach a much broader audience. And so I do hope that we're able to do more experimenting with that kind of work, but also more recognition of the significance that those kinds of projects hold.
Okay, we have another question. I was wondering about how generous thinking can push back against who is in the room in the first place. Is there a risk to preaching to the choir, and what would expand that group itself? Even if we build those rich relationships of solidarity within the university across ranks and hierarchies, are we depending on generosity or empathy to expand diversity in higher education? Whether diversity in terms of BIPOC faculty or class diversity or disability. What would galvanize such a change?
Oh, that is a question. And that is a super important one. And I think something that we really do need to be thinking about. Because I think, too often our approach to something like wanting to increase diversity within a field has been to what has been on the admissions end, right? We're going to hire 2 more faculty of color, or we're going to admit 3 more graduate students of color, or we're going to open a focus on disability studies, or what have you, right? That is sort of opening up the front end of the process without really examining who we are and what our assumptions within the existing programs and structures are, to really radically rethink like what our values ought to be, and are they themselves grounded in the kinds of diversity that we hope to foster. So for instance, I would really love to see a situation in which, I'm going to start this from a slightly different direction. A significant percentage of our students on campus, as they're coming to us at the undergraduate level right now, are first-generation college students. They're students of color. They're students who are coming from rural areas, particularly in land-grant institutions like my own. And frequently these students, if you actually get to talk to them about what it is they want from their educations, it becomes clear that those sorts of individualistic goals that a lot of our students are middle class students, are and so forth, students with families who have long histories with college, those students are coming to us with the kinds of stereotypical individualistic goals, like I need to get a degree so that I can get the right job, so that I can move on in my career, so that I can fill in the blank. Many of the other students that I first described, BIPOC students, students from rural areas, first-generation college students, come in with very different goals. Sometimes they are about individual achievement, and that's fine, but it's often individual achievement in the service of some larger communal or social goal, right? The student who wants to be able to learn whatever field it is they've chosen to study in order to take that learning back to their community and help improve the situation for others who didn't have the privilege of coming to the university. And what I would really love for us to do is, rather than bringing those students in and saying, welcome to our majors, which are structured exactly as they have been always, with the same goals and the same focuses and the same interests, instead to find out from those students what it is they need from their educations, and structure our curricular principles and our learning goals around their desires, rather than around whether it's the sort of our conventional sense of what needs to be known in the field, or around some kind of deficit model based understanding of what these students need to catch up on. In fact, I would really like to think about centering those students, and similarly centering the faculty and the graduate students who are coming from underrepresented groups and from minoritized groups, to say that we want this institution to be structured around the principles that make this a place that cares about you and that you care about. So how do we rethink what the institution is and how it functions in order to make this not just a place that can admit or hire a more diverse group, but in fact, that fosters that diversity and supports it all the way through.
Thank you. Another writer says, I think you have well considered institutional obstacles. Do you think, do you have some thoughts about how faculty who want to be more generous than we actually are might do inner psychological work to become more generous? As a comparison, I would like to be more loving, but it is not easy to do, or more forgiving. I flunked my last therapy course in forgiveness. I would not like to be fussy about words, categories, and count beans, and I would like to be less compulsive, etc. Now, I know to get therapy personally, but I'm wondering, in addition, are there ways that faculty who share non-generous psychological vulnerabilities, and I will be generous and say that we have been trained into by the individualistic system, work together to heal ourselves?
Oh, wow. I love that. I absolutely love that. Thank you so much for that question. So one of the earliest chapters in generous thinking is entirely about listening as a form of generosity. And it's really focused on like attempting to understand generosity, not as an act, right? It's not that I give you something that makes me generous, and not even really as a mindset like empathy. It's not that I try to understand you that makes me generous. It's that, in fact, I recognize that I don't understand you and that I can't understand you, but that I can try really hard to do so, and that it's my responsibility to continue to wrestle with my lack of understanding in order to develop a kind of sense of what it is that you're trying to say to me. So the example that I like to talk about from the scholarly realm of what it looks like to do that kind of work is Arlie Russell Hochschild's recent book, Strangers in Their Own Land. This book was originally handed to me because I'm from Southern Louisiana, and it's about like environmental devastation in Southwest Louisiana. And her attempt to sort of visit this community and figure out ultimately how an area of the country that's been so environmentally devastated by the oil and gas industry can be so anti-EPA, right? It is Tea Party Central, this area that she's looking at. And the deeper research question that she began this project with, and the thing that made me get interested in the book for, is her attempt to figure out why the political right and the political left in the United States were utterly speaking past one another, why it was impossible to have a conversation of any variety in which we could sort of stomach what one another were saying. And so this leads her into this particular study. And the thing that's so interesting about it is the way that she focuses throughout the book on her method, which was, basically spending 10 years in a small town outside Lake Charles, Louisiana, listening to people and trying to find out how they came to the beliefs that they have and why. And a lot of what she uncovers in this process about the how and the why is not pretty. It's all of the things that you would expect about, the ways that American politics has evolved in the last 20 years. But she ends up building this tremendous amount of trust with the people that she's talking to, because she listens really deeply to them telling their stories, and then does this thing where she attempts to tell what she understands as the deep narrative of their story, of their evolving political beliefs, back to them, and then says, do I have that right? Is that what it is? And they say, no, that's not it at all. You've completely misunderstood. And they tell her again. And then she tells them back, okay, so what I think I'm hearing is this. And they're like, no. And that process of really attempting to get it right, of really attempting to hear what it is that they're telling her, produces, I think, a kind of unexpected empathy in her for their position, but also a real trust in them of what it is she's trying to accomplish. And so this process of really listening and deeply trying to understand what seems to us utterly ununderstandable is one of the key things that I really point to as a kind of method. That it's about listening, and it's about being still with what we don't want to hear, and that is it is a deep challenge, and one that I am not claiming to be as good at as I should be. But it's something that I do continue to work on, is to really, listen.
Thank you. I think when you think about Arlie Hochschild's method and the time it takes to listen, this next question fits in a very different way. I have a concern about the rate of work in the humanities. The world is now in a civilizational crisis over mainly climate change, which is increasing risks to culture and governance around the world, such as Texas today, or the wildfires in California, and so on. Many scientists are concerned that humanity faces existential risks that must be addressed within a maximum of a decade. An academic article might take 5 years from start to print and then be read by only 10 people. I agree with you that work with the public is an important option and should be rewarded, but could we also work faster and speed up thinking, reflection, and publication?
Sort of. I think so. I think that we have, for all of the obvious reasons, as scholars, a tendency to hold back the work that we are doing until it's complete, right? So that article takes 5 years start to finish, the book takes 10. And there is nothing out there of what we're doing until it's done. And what I would really love for us to move toward is an environment in which we value process as much as product, and in which we're allowed to engage in some of the messy parts of that process publicly. So in my own career, I started blogging back in 2002, super early in academic years, and wound up in the process. At first it was purely about immediate gratification, right? Nobody was reading the formal work that I was publishing, or if they were, they certainly weren't telling me. And I wanted to feel like there was an audience engaged with the work that I was doing and with the things that I was interested in writing about. But the blog ultimately became a place in which I was able to think out loud with a group of interested people, some of them scholars, some of them not, about the things that I was interested in. And, every piece of formally published writing that I have done since 2002, in some sense has its origin in that blog. I find myself kind of writing over and over again about a particular thing and suddenly think, oh, wait, right, this is actually something bigger that I should pursue. And the work sort of evolves from there. Now, doing that kind of work in public requires some of that vulnerability that I was talking about, like being willing to let the messiness of our early thought processes show, and being willing to acknowledge the places where we have one idea and we write about it for a couple of blog posts and then we realize we're completely wrong and we should be thinking about it differently. But I think doing that kind of work in public, warts and all, can be extraordinarily productive, not just for us, because we get that feedback and are able to take that feedback on board. for the work that we're doing, because we can get parts of it out there sooner and really enable some of the key ideas to begin to take root in a broader culture. But also, I think that it's really good, frankly, for our students, because I think our students, I mean, they only see scholarly work in the field in its final finished form. And I think frequently our students have this idea that our journal articles like spring whole cloth from our heads with properly formatted footnotes and all, and that it's not a struggle for us to produce this, that we're not wrong, that we don't rethink things. And I think that that winds up, sort of when we talk about the ways that we ask our students to revise, and they don't know what we mean on some fundamental level, they sort of correct the things we marked, but don't really rethink an argument over time. It's because they don't see us doing it, right? They only see the final product. And I think if we were able to move toward that revaluation of process, we might both enable the students that we're working with to see what process looks like, but also, as you were asking, to then like get the work out in ways that might be more timely, or that might allow us, in fact, to linger in an argument while nonetheless still feeling like we're getting things out there, right? So.
Great, thanks. A quick follow-up. What's the URL of your blog? And if you spell it out, we will enter it in the chat so everybody can see it.
Sure. It's kfitz, so kfitz.info, info.
That's pretty easy.
Yeah, not too bad.
Even I could remember that. Okay. And this is really less of a question than a comment, according to the author. It would be great if the university community realized that forsaking the ideals that used to fuel public education and the public good are alienating former first generation and otherwise socially marginalized students who are here, but have lost the ways of being and doing that would better enable us to support the newcomer generation in sustaining ways.
Yeah, I think that's really smart and something that we need to think about a great deal. I think that our institutions, even when they claim to be welcoming, can be profoundly alienating places, and really examining what it is that causes that alienation. It's going to require some painful soul searching and really thinking about what our purpose is in the institution. So thank you.
I have a quick question, which is, you talked about the issue of generous thinking and building solidarity and community as a way to navigate the crises. But are there particular aspects of the current crises that you see as opportunities to encourage more generous thinking?
I do. And I am particularly inclined today, for the obvious reason, to think about Texas and what's happening there right now. This state is in a really desperate crisis. People are freezing to death. There is no water in a lot of communities. This is a state level Flint, Michigan, that has been allowed to occur. And not everyone in that state who's been affected by this crisis is going to look at it and say, gee, maybe regulating our electrical grid would be a good idea after all. Or maybe our state leaders, like our governor and our senator, are not helping us in the way that they seem to. Not everybody is going to have that sort of change of heart. But I do think there's an opportunity for helping folks who feel blindsided by what has occurred to really, first of all, helping them so that they are no longer freezing to death and no longer without water. But also like helping them to reconcile what their state's individualist mandate that, is saying to them out loud, y'all are on your own, right? You are your own. I mean, I saw something go by on Twitter earlier today where a woman saw a transformer blow in her backyard and a line fell and it caught the tree in her backyard on fire. So she called the fire department and was told, you are your own fire department now. And that presents, I think, a real opportunity to ask people, is this the way we want to live? Do we want to be our own fire department? Are we not a society? And is there not a value in thinking about what it is we owe to each other? And that, I think, is the kind of opportunity that some of the worst of the crises that we face present. I also think that COVID-19, for better or for worse, has presented another kind of opportunity for the university in particular, which is unfortunately not one that many universities have availed themselves of, but that enables, that opens the door to the necessity of the university recognizing its duty of care for not just its on-campus community, not just its students and its faculty and its staff, but also for the communities that surround it. And I do hope that more institutions in the coming months will begin to think about what it is that they might do to support the rebuilding of their areas, to support the health of the people in their areas, and to really recognize that if we're ever going to move back to a place in which we understand public higher education as being a social good, one that should be state funded and state supported, that it's going to necessitate the university saying to the state, we are the state, right? We are the state, and we are responsible for the people of the state. And here is how we're going to demonstrate that. So I think there are opportunities. I think they're hard to take advantage of because we are in an era in which the university has been led over the course of 40 years to understand itself as a business with a bottom line and a board of directors to which it is responsible. And that understanding causes a form of leadership that really makes us think about revenue models and about ensuring that we've got enough people on campus paying tuition and so forth, rather than thinking about the good of the community, and really taking the opportunity to refocus and say our duty of care outweighs our business model is, I think, it's an opportunity, and I would really love to see more institutions take it up.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. And thanks to all of the audience for some incredibly good questions and for your presence. And I hope some of you will join us tomorrow morning from 10 to 12 for the Human in the Data Symposium. Have a safe and warm evening. Take care. Thanks so much, Kathleen.
Thank you. Thank you.